Hello and welcome to Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'm your host for this show, which is designed to give all of us a little better insight into the doings around our capital and the people who make things happen in our community. Our guest today is a woman who's been very involved with victims, assisting them for years, developing programs so that we'll better understand the needs and concerns of victims, and now working in Marion County as the head of the Victims Assistance Program. Her name is Carolyn Eccles, and I hope that you'll all join me in welcoming her. Welcome to our show.
Thank you, Kevin.
We've been talking a little bit before we started taping this program, and I was developing some information from you about your background, and I found it was quite interesting. But rather than have me tell you what your own background is, one of the things we like to hear from folks is something about where they're from, where they went to school. Can you give us a little bit of a synopsis of your own background?
Sure. I was raised in Oregon and have lived in Oregon most of my life. I graduated from Oregon State University.
And that was in 1982?
1981.
Oh, 81.
And worked in the Benton County District Attorney's Office at that time, starting their victim assistance program. And then in the mid-1980s, moved back to Virginia and worked in Washington, D.C. for the National Organization for Victim Assistance, and then came back to Oregon in 1988.
Now, you met your husband while you were back in Virginia.
I did. We lived across the street from each other in Virginia and met in a famous East Coast snowstorm where we were snowed in, couldn't leave the area, so we went sledding.
There's a story right there, I would think.
That's right.
And when did you come back to Oregon?
We came back in the summer of 1988.
Now, it seems to me from looking at your resume that your whole professional career has been focused on victims. Was this something you thought about while you were in school?
No, it was interesting. When I was in college, no one ever mentioned the word victims at all. I was a political science major. I had started in psychology and went to sociology trying to figure out what I was going to do. And in all those courses, no one ever mentioned the word victims. So I was focusing on going into either law enforcement or law school. And it was my senior year when I was looking for an internship that I spoke with the internship advisor at Oregon State University, and they suggested going to the district attorney's office and working with victims, and that was the first time I had ever heard the concept. And so I came into it sort of happenstance, and that's been my whole career.
Well, tell me a little bit about your East Coast experience back in Washington, D.C. With the federal government. What was that all about?
The group that I worked for was actually a nonprofit agency, and it acts as an umbrella to victims services organizations and victims' rights nationwide. And my job there was somewhat twofold. I was the manager of all the direct services that we would provide to victims all around the nation, which accounted for about 10,000 victim contacts a year. So we were very busy working with victims of crime across the nation. Then the other piece of it was that I was a trainer, and so I would travel extensively and provide training and technical assistance to all sorts of agencies and groups trying to develop services for victims. There was in the last year of it, there was an additional part that grew that was unexpected, and that was called crisis response work. And that's where we would go into communities after a major disaster, such as mass murders or train crashes, and help that community to mobilize themselves to deal with the aftermath. And we started that about my last year there, so that was pretty much what my life was focused on then.
Can you give us some idea of the trend nationally, and then we'll talk locally too. I want to focus on Marion County later on, but nationally over the last 20, 30 years, or whatever time frame you think is appropriate, in terms of how we've moved towards recognizing the needs of victims?
It's really been a phenomenal movement, if you can call it that. Really, the area of victimology and victim services and victims' rights is less than 20 years old, actually. While there was an effort in the late 60s towards working with women of domestic violence and sexual assault, the general victim services really didn't start until the mid-70s with LEAA funding, Law Enforcement Administration funding. And that started about 8 programs in the mid-70s, and now, less than 20 years later, there are more than 6,000 programs nationwide. In the early 80s, there were few, if any, legislative rights for victims or statutes that involved victims, and now I believe that 44 states have bills of rights for victims. So legislatively, there's been phenomenal growth there. There's also now, and this has happened just in the last probably 8 years or so, there's been amendments to state constitutions for victims. And I believe that there's now somewhere around 10 states that have amendments in their constitution for victims. So the growth from a legislative standpoint, from public policy, and from services has been quite phenomenal.
I wonder if there isn't something to the phenomenon of the Warren Court era beginning in the 50s, running into the 60s, where defendants' rights, criminal defendants' rights, were emphasized. And of course, we need to recognize that means citizens' rights, because these were citizens who happened to be charged with crime, but still people would recognize ultimately most of these people have been tried and convicted, and then they're trying to assert citizens' rights. And the Warren Court in particular, the U.S. Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren, came down with some landmark decisions about the rights of those accused of crime. And do you think that there was some societal reaction to this, saying, well, yes, okay, that's fine, let's stand up for citizens' rights in terms of being charged with a crime, but how about the victims of crime? Let's be understanding of their needs too. What do you think about that?
I think that was probably one of the contributing factors. I think there was a lot of research that was done, that actually the movement kind of started based on research around, there was some early research around victim and witness cooperation in quotes, with the criminal justice system. And what they found is that what we deemed as uncooperative victims and witnesses were actually quite often people who didn't know how to participate, didn't know what was expected of them, weren't provided information, support. And so there was this research that somewhat contributed to the movement as well.
So there's an understanding then that, gee, I mean, you didn't choose to be victimized by crime, and you're not necessarily, most people aren't trained in the criminal justice system and how to deal with it. They don't know what's coming next, and I guess the system itself wasn't trained to understand that and to deal with that.
Right. As you know, it is the state of Oregon versus the defendant, and it's the people. We here in California, the O.J. Simpson case, it's the people versus O.J. Simpson. The victim is not a party in that case. They are like a witness in the case. And so if you start from that premise, yeah, then it makes sense then that we didn't really think about in those early stages providing additional services or support for victims. And so it grew, and a lot of the growth has come directly from victims themselves who've come forward and said, this is what happened, this is not okay, this is what I need. For instance, the whole movement against drunk driving. I mean, if we think about what's happened in the last 10 to 15 years around drunk driving, that all started because one woman, one mother of one child who was killed by a repeat drunk driver, said, this isn't okay, this isn't acceptable, what about my rights, what about my daughter's rights? And she started what became just an amazing movement nationwide, which has changed not only the laws around drinking and driving, but how we perceive it as a society and how we live our lives as individuals.
It's no longer a joke.
No, it's not. It's not. Now you see people saying, you can't drink and drive, I'm going to take your keys, whereas 10, 15 years ago, a lot of people would drink and drive and not have a second thought about it. So. And
people would be snickering about how they managed to get home from the party without going into the ditch.
Right. I don't even remember how I got here. You know, how many times have you heard that? But somehow I made it home. Absolutely. And that all started because one victim was angry.
Now, as part of this, and I'm still looking at the dynamics of the movement for victims, would it be fair to say that part of this may be because of the growth of our society, we've become a more mobile society, that in times past, say in small-town America, victims may have received more support from the community and more understanding because they were among friends, but now, as our society has grown, we may need more of a structure to provide a support network, or am I just off base on that?
Well, I think there's probably something to that. I haven't thought about it in those terms. From what I hear from people who were victims 20, 30, 40 years ago, they didn't talk about it, particularly if they're victims of domestic violence and sexual violence. They just didn't talk about it. I remember when I was working back east, I got a phone call once from a victim who was very, very distraught, and it was very difficult to figure out what it was his issues were, and I had a sense from his voice that he was an older man. And after talking to him for some time, I was able to find out that his parents and his siblings had been murdered. And I had a sense that it was a pretty recent crime that occurred, and it turned out that it actually had occurred 44 years prior to. And he was in severe crisis 44 years later. And I can't help but wonder if maybe he didn't have anywhere to go 44 years ago to talk about it. He was orphaned, perhaps didn't have people that he could talk to about it, people he could get support from, and 44 years later it became a major issue in his life. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of things to it.
Let me pause for a moment and mention to our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, your host for the show. If you ever have any questions or concerns, feel free to write to me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. I'm always happy to hear from you. Our guest is Carolyn Eccles. She is the head of the Marion County Victim Assistance Program, and we've been talking about the background of the development of concern for victims' rights. Mm-hmm. And this sort of brings me around to Oregon and its programs as opposed to the rest of the nation. How do we look in Oregon in terms of progress on victim assistance programs?
Oregon has also always been considered a leader in the area of legislative efforts and public policy reform. I remember in the early 80s, my first time up at the legislature, when we went up, a small group of us, and tried to get funding for victim services. And I remember the reaction from the legislature was, victims? Oh, like they hadn't really thought about it either. We were successful in getting that legislation passed, but we were one of the first states that had done that. And so we became a model for other states in developing creative funding bases for victim services, and we continue to keep pace with other states and lead in some areas. We do not have a constitutional amendment for victims here in Oregon, and so we've kind of dropped in the pack from that, but in a lot of other areas we've been very progressive.
Now, what kind of constitutional amendments are we talking about when you talk about a constitutional amendment for victims?
Well, there was, in 1984, there was a President's Task Force on Victims of Crime, and they came out with a series of recommendations aimed at providing rights and services to victims. And one of their recommendations was to add an amendment to the U.S. Constitution which would give victims the right to be heard and to be present at all critical stages of judicial proceedings. The move at a national level to get an amendment to the U.S. Constitution has not been successful, and there hasn't actually been a lot of effort put into that. But the approach has been to get states to do that, and Oregon has made a couple of attempts towards that and has not been successful. The rationale or the reasoning behind an amendment to the Oregon Constitution is that the rights that are now legislated for victims, there is no remedy or recourse for victims if they don't have access to those rights, if they're not afforded those rights. And so it would put some teeth into the statutes that currently exist for victims.
Would we consider, if we don't go constitutional amendment, putting some teeth in the statutes themselves by saying that victims could bring legal action if they're not given the rights which are specified in the statutes?
That would be another really good way of doing it. I understand people's reticence in making amendments to state and U.S. Constitution, and I think that that's been one of the stumbling blocks or the obstacles for Oregon and other states. And so that may be another way to go about it. The Bill of Rights that exists now, for the most part, I think, are working around the state, but there's still those pockets where procedures and policies have not been implemented, where their victims know that they have those rights and know how to access them.
Well, let's talk for a moment about those rights. Can you give us an overview as to the rights of the victims in Oregon under statute?
There's a variety of them. There's one which allows the victim to be in the courtroom during the entire trial of the case in which they've become a victim. But as you are aware, in most criminal cases, probably in most civil cases, witnesses are excluded. In other words, they're not allowed in the courtroom except for when they're testifying. The right then allows victims to be in the courtroom during the entire proceedings, but that's not happening across the state. Prosecutors may say, well, I don't want you in there for whatever reasons, maybe it's strategy-wise or whatever, or they're not telling victims that they have those rights. And so, and from what I've heard from victims is that that's a really important issue for them because the defendant is in the courtroom the entire time. Why can't I be in the courtroom the entire time? This affects me and impacts me as well. So that's one of the examples.
Would you think that it'd be important for the legislature next session to take a look at referring such a constitutional amendment to the people for a vote?
I think that looking at it in that vein, or as you said earlier, looking at putting some teeth into the current statute would be, is timely, and I think that the citizens would respond to that probably favorably.
Well, that's something that we ought to probably follow up on a little bit later
right.
after this program. As extending from that, now there's a difference between victims' compensation and victims' assistance. Now we have victims' compensation programs to help those who are physically injured in crime. Could you talk about that a little bit and distinguish the two?
Yeah, that's a point of real confusion for people. Crime victims' compensation is a state program that operates out of the Department of Justice or the Attorney General's office, and that program has a mix of funding, but some of the funding is general fund. Some of the funding comes from offenders paying penalties, either in the state of Oregon and also at the federal level. So there's a lot of money going into it that actually comes from offenders. The money is there for victims of violent crimes to cover such things as medical, rehabilitative costs, in the case of murder, funeral expenses, loss of support to family, loss of wages for someone who's injured, and counseling costs. And there are caps on it. There's an application process, but it's a real positive program, and has really enabled victims to deal a little bit with the financial impact of crime.
One of the unknown parts about this is that part of the funding for that comes from punitive damages. When people read about civil cases where a jury awards punitive damages, meaning punishment damages in the civil case against somebody who was found to have done something wrong civilly, the jury is allowed, if punitive damages are sought, to make an award, but as I recall, a proportion of those punitive damages go into the victim compensation fund. I don't know if it's a third or a half. It's a large piece of that.
Right, right.
So when people are upset about punitive damages, they need to recognize not all of that money goes to the person who brought the case.
And the other thing that we tell victims is that this isn't a welfare program. It's not. It is money, for the most part, from convicted offenders, and that, I think, makes them feel a little bit better about accessing those funds and using those resources.
Now let's talk about victims' assistance in Marion County and the kinds of programs that you're able to provide, the kinds of services. Can you give us an overview on that?
Yeah, Marion County was one of the first programs in Oregon established in 1981, and it was started with an emphasis on responding to victims of sexual assault, victims of rape. And that continues to be one of our priorities. We've grown in terms of number of staff, number of volunteers, and the types of programs that we provide since 1981. But we are based in the District Attorney's Office with our emphasis working with victims of violent crime, sexual assault, child abuse, survivors of homicide victims, and domestic violence.
If I was a victim of a crime, would you be contacting me, or do I need to contact you? How does the process work?
It's somewhat complex. It would depend on what would happen with your case. There are a lot of crimes that are reported to law enforcement that never make it to the District Attorney's Office for prosecution. Either there's no suspect, there's not enough evidence there, whatever. There's a lot of cases that don't make it to that step. So we probably wouldn't hear about you if you simply reported to law enforcement and that was the end of it. Unless your situation was very, well, if it was a sexual assault, we would hear about it one way or the other if it was a homicide. But say if it was a burglary, we probably wouldn't hear about it. If your case made it to the District Attorney's Office, you would receive notification from our office, which would include the Bill of Rights for victims and an opportunity for you to provide input into what could be the sentence if there was a conviction. It's called a victim impact statement. And then we would provide to you updates, regular updates on the status of the case. And you would be allowed an opportunity to participate in the sentencing if there was one. If you were the survivor of a homicide victim, if you were a sexual assault victim or your children were abused, then you would have an advocate assigned to you, someone who would be there to talk with you, to prepare you for court hearings, in other words, letting you know what's going to happen, what's expected of you.
That's the CASA program, the Court-Appointed Special Advocate, or is it something else?
No, that's what we do. The CASA program works in the juvenile section, working with dependency cases, children who are caught up in the system, perhaps in foster care, who don't have a home where they can go to at this time, and there's not necessarily criminal proceedings under those situations.
All right, let's talk a little bit more about that, but let's pause for a moment.
Okay.
And I'll mention to our audience that you're with us on Capitol Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix, your host for the program. Our guest is Carolyn Eccles, the head of the Marion County Victim Assistance Program. If you ever have any questions or concerns, feel free to write to me at Capitol Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon 97310. I'm always happy to hear from you. We were talking about the Marion County program and victims assistance and the services that are available. And I'm wondering, where would we be in terms of outreach to other victims? It sounds as though right now the programs focus on the assistance to the victim in the context of a prosecution, a crime which is capable of prosecution. And as you mentioned, there are many crimes where there's a report and there's no suspect, so nothing much happens. Should we be trying to expand victim assistance programs to more of an outreach program to reach these kinds of victims?
Well, that's certainly my bias. I think that while we do a lot in Marion County for victims and we service a lot of people, we also miss a lot of people. And there are a lot of things that we would like to be doing, a lot of victims we would like to be focusing our efforts on, and we just don't have the resources. We have staff and we have about 55 volunteers, and we are doing what we can with those people, but to expand to other types of victims and to increase sort of our circle of services, we would need more resources to do that.
Are there any resources in the police department itself or the sheriff's department in Marion County, and I'm thinking of the city police departments as well as Salem and the towns that have police departments. Are there resources there where people are available to talk to victims, or is it really dependent on your office?
I think that some of the agencies do have some resources available, particularly if you're a victim of a burglary. There's the Crime Prevention Unit, which will go out at a person's request and talk to them about things that they can do to make their home safer, and so there's definitely some support that's provided there. But in terms of just having someone on staff in any of our local police agencies to work with the victims, that we don't have that here. There are some jurisdictions around the nation that do have victim services in police departments, but I think that there's only, that I'm aware of, there's only one police department in Oregon that does that.
Should we have a two-stage process, assuming resources were available, where you can have victim services for anyone reporting a crime, provided, say, through the police agencies or an independent agency associated with the police, and then the second stage is they would hand it off to an operation such as yours once a suspect is identified and charges are filed and prosecution begins?
I think that there would be a lot of benefits to that, and that would be a good situation. I think that short of having resources, what we need to do is to make sure that everyone that comes in contact with victims of crime knows how to deal with them. It amazes me how few people in the criminal justice system have had training on victimology, crisis reaction, crisis intervention, and how to provide support services. It is traditional that dispatchers, people who handle the 911 system, have had no training on stress and crisis and how to deal with someone in crisis. That boggles my mind. And if people who are in crisis early on can talk to someone, whether it's you as a legislator or it's a dispatcher or police officer who understands the issues that they're dealing with, they may not need actual victim services. They just need someone who knows how to respond to them. And if we had that in place, I think that that would do a lot.
If you were given an opportunity to say, here are 5 to 10 things that can be done, regardless of resources, in the next couple of years, in terms of assisting victims, what would you recommend in terms of our community or the state as a whole?
Well, I think what I just said is training. I think training is critical in the area of victimology and victim services, everywhere from police academy to law school. My husband recently graduated from law school and never got any training on issues like that, to dispatchers, to EMTs, to everyone that gets involved in that. I think that regardless of resources, well, I would like to see more done legislatively for victims. I would like to obviously see more services put in place and coordination of services to make sure there's no duplication. Those would probably be the big ones that I would focus on.
Do you rely heavily on groups such as the domestic violence advocacy groups and support groups to help you extend services to victims? We
are very connected with them. I am the chair of the Marion County Domestic Violence Council, and it's a group of professionals in all different disciplines that have come together to talk about domestic violence and to change the way in which Marion County responds to it. And through that networking, we work very closely with the Mid-Valley Women's Crisis Service and other agencies to make sure that victims know what services are available to them so they can access them.
In terms of victim services, I guess the image that a lot of folks have is basically in the domestic violence context. And maybe we need to help the public to understand that we're talking about all victims of crime, but probably the people who most need services are victims of sex crimes or domestic violence, and they're not the same, and I recognize that. And of course, many of us would argue that any so-called sex crime is actually also a crime of violence.
Absolutely.
The question I would have is there some way we can get the message out to the public that victim services are available? Should flyers be provided to victims by the police, or what kind of mechanism would you recommend?
The police are actually mandated by law to provide information to victims about victims' compensation, for example. That happens often, but not all the time, that victims get that information. We have worked with we have developed a card, what we call a palm card, that all law enforcement agencies are now using to hand out to victims of domestic violence. It talks about the law, it talks about our program, Women's Crisis Service and Crime Victims Compensation, and temporary restraining orders. And so law enforcement agencies all through Marion County are now handing those out. And that in part satisfies a mandate, a legislative mandate, but it also just satisfies the need to let victims know what services are there. So we've done a few things. There's probably a lot more that we could do.
Well, as we try to address victims' rights in the next couple of years, there's also a lot of noise out there, and I happen to be one of the noise generators. And I shouldn't just say noise. There's substantial proposals to change the criminal justice system to toughen sanctions. Do you folks have any particular reaction to how victims feel about this when they see someone charged with a significant crime and then end up serving no time in the criminal justice system other than maybe a little pretrial detention time, but then the sentence is probation? What kind of reaction do you get out of victims?
They're angry, they're frustrated, they are disillusioned. I think that a lot of us were raised to believe that, gee, if something goes wrong, tell a police officer and the police officer is going to make it all better, sort of symbolic of the system's going to take care of you. And they get into the system, they're in crisis, they're experiencing a lot of loss, a lot of trauma, and they find out that the system doesn't make it all better, that justice is not served in their minds for what their needs are. They're very, very frustrated. They're very dissatisfied. That's not in all cases, but in a lot of the cases we do hear that.
Well, how would you respond? And I get this question all the time when I talk about tougher sanctions. People say, well, it's so expensive. My response is, of course, well, justice costs money, and it does take, and you can't just measure justice in terms of how many dollars are spent, but you have to measure it in terms of the absolute sanction that society puts on a crime. What is your reaction to the standard of justice where we say at some point we will punish the offender?
Well, we absolutely have to, and it is definitely going to cost money. What we have been doing doesn't seem to have been working. You know, we have these repeat offenders, we have people going out and committing more and more violent crimes, and we have to do something. We definitely have to do something, and it's going to cost money to do that. I also have a bias, and that is that we need to really look at our juvenile offenders, because a lot of the people that we're seeing as adult offenders started as juvenile offenders, and maybe as a juvenile offender, maybe an intervention might have more of a likelihood of being successful.
I think the good news is that you will see major reforms proposed for the juvenile justice system next session. And on that positive note, I'll thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
I'll thank our audience for joining us on Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix, your host. Our guest has been Carolyn Eccles from the Marion County Victim Assistance Program. Thanks again for joining us.